I would like to thank you, Necipoğlu, for introducing me, and also I would like to thank her and AGAKAN program for giving this chance to do a research and present it here in this excellent intellectual atmosphere. I would like to thank Sibel Bozdağ, Cemal Kafadar, Christina Maranci, and Elizabeth Wood for their all academic supports. As you will see, most of the sources are Russian and some of them Armenian. I was able to reach Russian and Armenian sources by the generous help of András Rittmeyer, Michael Grossman, Svetlana Rukelman, and Ani Babayan, librarians and scholars who are definitely the angels of the knowledge. I would like to thank them all, and I would like to thank Alice West. She translated several pages from Russian, and also guided me a lot. I would like to thank Darya Kovaleva for her help in preparing political maps from the software Centennia. And I would like to thank my children, Tan and Yaprak. As a family of 3, we managed to live in a new country. And during that time, they were not only patient, but also very helpful. Let me begin now. On the Armenian, formerly the Soviet Union border of Turkey, Kars used to be a multicultural city composed of Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Georgians, Russians, and Azeris. The city and its province were occupied by Russia between 1877 and 1917, during which a new city was built with a gridded urban plan and furnished with magnificent churches and other public buildings. However, up until now, the city of Kars has primarily been the subject of war and political historians concerned with the imperial politics. Its urban and architectural history hasn't been studied in terms of a deeper understanding of the complex relations between modernity, Russian colonization, and the memories of its traumatic past. Here, my aim is to present multiple histories of the Russian colonial architecture and urbanism of Kars. The case of Kars is meaningful not only because of its neglected architectural and urban history, but also as a colonization project of the Russian Empire. While colonization studies mostly focus on European countries, Russian colonization has mostly been neglected in historiography. Russian colonization needs to be studied further, and the case of Kars provides a good example for it. Dealing with such complexity, historically contested among different groups, requires defining an urban and architectural history writing approach from a perspective of peace. One of the major goals of my research is to contribute to a larger project of humanity and reconciliation above all nationalities and cultural differences. In addition to this methodological and positional effort, the history of Kars provides a fertile example in South Caucasus, where 3 dynasties intersected. After the critical breaking point of the 1970 revolution and the First World War, the Romanov, Ottoman, and Qajar dynasties perished, and the territory was ruled by different new regimes. A comparative study of the histories of the cities of Kars, Bakü, Yerevan, Gümrü, Tbilisi, and Batum has a lot to tell us. These 6 cities, colonized by the Russian Empire, have experienced modernity in different ways and dealt with the problems of memory, reconstruction, and deconstruction through diverse range of responses. This research on Kars within the context of South Caucasus offers an opportunity to compare different urban histories in the Middle East, Balkans, and Caucasus from a broader perspective. As a South Caucasus corridor close to the ancient Silk Road, the city of Kars was always a battlefield between different civilizations. As an Ottoman border city, it was under attacks from Persians till the 18th century. Russian Empire came to the stage later. During the 19th century, the Russian Empire tried to occupy the city 4 times, in 1807, 1828, 1855, and 1877. In 1856, at the end of the Crimean War, Karl Marx published 4 articles on Kars in the New York Tribune. These articles are known as the Kars Papers in Marxist literature. Alexander Pushkin, the founder of Russian literature, visited Kars and published his travel notes. James Morier, a British diplomat, traveled in the Qajar Iran and published a novel, Ayşe, the Maid of Kars. A mystic and philosopher, George Gurdjieff, born in Gümrü and raised in Kars. Regardless of its rich history, Kars tried to forget the memories of unpleasant Russian occupation and ignore its ancient Armenian past. While a significant effort was employed to eradicate the remnants of the Russian and Armenian past, the Turkish and Muslim past of the city was reviewed and constructed in the meantime. Destruction of the Russian war memorial was followed by demolition of churches or by cutting of their bulbous domes, as we will see. However, replacing of desired memories with undesired ones was not sufficient for a city to be noteworthy. The city passed into complete oblivion in Turkey for decades. Turkish poet Cemal Süreya wrote a poem on Kars. His description of Kars as a distant city represents the general idea of the city in the public's mind. Another poet from Turkey, Atol Behramoğlu, educated in a primary school in Kars, also had the same theme of farness in his poem. In 2002, Orhan Pamuk, worldwide famous Nobel Prize winner, elegantly described the loneliness and forgottenness of the city of Kars in his novel Snow, Kar. This novel brought a little spark on the neglected beauty of Kars. While Kars was a distant and remote town for many Turks, the Armenians cherished warm memories of Kars as their ancient capital. Yegishe Charents, a 20th century Armenian poet laureate, born and raised in Kars, had poems about Kars and had written a novel about Kars called Land of Nairi. To signify the reconciliation process in Armenian-Turkish relations, a half-man figure in 30 meters high, the Statue of Humanity, which was visible from Armenia, was erected in Kars. Reconciliation required recalling of the past, which wanted to be forgotten. Unfortunately, the nearly completed statue was demolished in 2011 by the order of then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. However, the process of remembering Kars was not over. Traveling by train to this distant, unknown, forgotten city, especially in winter, is becoming a popular activity nowadays. Several movies on Kars or in some way related to Kars have been shot over the last 10 years. In these movies, however, Kars appears as distant, cold, forgotten, and unfamiliar. It's not easy to contextualize a city which has suffered from various invasions for centuries It has different influences from diverse cultural backgrounds spread across thousands of years. In the 19th century, the history of Kars and its close neighbor cities of Caucasus, Batum, Gümrü, Tbilisi, Yerevan, and Baku, were shaped by a strong desire of the Russian Romanov dynasty to expand. Ottoman and Persian dynasties were in decline and losing lands to Russians. The Russians' quest for access to Persian and the Baltic Sea coast led the Russian Empire to expand its territories. On their way through the South Caucasus, the Russians conquered cities besides Kars. The Qajar dynasty lost Tbilisi, Baku, and Gümrü in 1813 and Yerevan in 1828. The Ottomans held their eastern border against the Russians until 1877. In the end, Kars was lost after the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877-1878, which is sadly in the memory of the people living in the region as the 93 Harbi, the War of 93. You can see how Russian Empire expanded its territory not only through Balkans but also through South Caucasus. The cities of Tbilisi, Baku, and Gümrü were established as a gubernia, a Russian model of civil governorate, while Kars became the center of the Kars Oblast, Russian military governorate. Kars was connected to Gümrü and Baku by train, besides railroad. All area here we are discussing had other modern communication facilities such as postal and telegraph services. Three nations, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, were declared after 1970 revolution. However, the Russian Red Army invaded Tbilisi, Yerevan, and Baku and announced the Soviet rule there. After the Treaty of Kars, signed by the Soviet and Turkish governments, Kars returned to Turkish authorities. To emphasize again, the 19th century history of the Caucasus cities, Batum, Gümrü, Tbilisi, Yerevan, Baku, and Kars, should be studied within a shared common context, not as isolated cities, but as a part of a broader milieu. Before focusing on Russian modernization efforts, we need to briefly review the history of Kars. Kars became a capital 2 times. The area of Armenia where Kars is located, also known as Nairi. As a summary, the 10th century capital city was taken over by Byzantines, Selçuklular, Georgians, Mongols, Timur, Karakoyunlu, Akkoyunlu, Safavids, and finally the Ottomans. You can see all these invasions for centuries. The 12th century Kars Castle, which is one of the significant symbols of Kars, here, was located on a hill while the river of Kars curved around it. An Ottoman settlement called Kaleiçi Mahallesi, you can see here, it's roughly here, surrounded the castle, which stretched along the river and route to Erzurum. Documents dating back to 1856 shows houses around the castle, but there is no sign of the Russian gridded settlement on the map, this area. Next to the river, we can see one of the most recognizable monuments of Kars, Armenian Church of the Holy Apostles. Here is the Apostles' Castle. Kars Fortress, Vartan Bridge, and The Church of Apostles defined and gained metaphorical meanings in Yegesh Echar'ın's novel Land of Nairi. Let me read a few lines which describes the old city from Char'ın's novel. Is the fort any less a miracle, or the bridge of Vartan, or the Church of the Apostles? Which one shall I cite? All of them are miracles, extraordinary, impossible marvels. Let us begin with the fortress which sits harsh, forbidding, like a stern oriental tyrann on the western edge of the city, high on the rocky yellow hill. From its lofty throne, it peers down on the city. It may be a vast assemblage of stones dropped casually from the sky. Only fools can fail to be entranced by that fortress. Now, before going into the details of the physical transformation of Kars, we need to look at how many people lived in the city at the time. In 1827, 8,000 people were living in the city center. In 1903, the population rose to 15,000. We can roughly estimate that the number of people living in Kars doubled when the limits of the city expanded under the Russian rule. Now we can look closer at the Russian urban planning implemented in Kars. As I noted previously, the urban and architectural history of Kars hasn't been studied yet. Different sources claim that the city was planned by a Deutsch planner and its buildings were made in Baltic style, but no dates, explanations, details, or sources are ever provided. Throughout my research at Harvard, I tried to figure out simple questions of who designed or envisioned the city plan, when it was designed, and how it was implemented. Since the beginning of my research, I discovered several sources which have helped me respond to these questions. Unsurprisingly, most of the sources come from the Russian Empire's publications. From the Statistical Review for Kars Oblast as of January 1, published in 1904, which I will refer to as Statistical Review from now on, I have learned that the new city development plan was approved in 1881. The Russian government began to implement the new plan 3 years after Kars' occupation. Here it should be noted that according to an agreement between the Russian Empire and the Ottomans, the local Muslims were given 3 years to decide whether to stay or leave. It can be argued that the Russian administration delayed any construction 3 years before of this agreement. However, I do not have enough information to discuss this assumption further. The new plan and construction were led by Kars Modernization Committee, established in 1882 and dissolved in 1902. The committee's goal was to modernize Kars, as was explicitly declared in the committee's name. Here, at least, having the name of the committee can be helpful. From Yves Blau's recent publication, we learned that Baku was planned by a German engineer and architect, Nikolaus von der Non, who was also the director of the Baku City Planning Office. I do not know if the director of Kars Modernization Committee was the planner at the same time or not. Even though I do not have enough information to compare the two cities' local regulation, I will keep the Baku's experiment in mind, as it can be meaningful for further stages of research. Statistical review requires further analysis since it offers clues to the Russian Empire's vision of modernization and clarifies the Kars Modernization Committee's efforts. Modernization enjoys distractions. As Goethe showed in Faust, the old should be demolished entirely before creating the new. A map from a Russian military book shows the old market bazaar on the outskirts of the Kars fortress in 1878. Here is the castle, and you can see the old settlement. This market, which was described in Statistical Review as a source of, I'm quoting, dirt and illness, was demolished as part of the modernization's hygienic ambition. Then the modernization went on replacing the labyrinths of the residential homes and depressing, in quotation again, depressing cemeteries. Another map dated to 1910 shows new white boulevards running in the direction from Castle to the railroad. Here is the station. On a grid plan. Once irregular and depressing were removed, new boulevards were created, and all new boulevards and squares were macadamized or cobbled. The use of the word depressing in the Russian sources is quite noteworthy, as we will discuss later. The old city was populated new stone shops. The history of public services is another interesting subject, but here we will simply note that these new shops, unlike the old shops, were built without courtyards to prevent garbage to pile there, as the locals often do, according to Russian authorities. Regularity, which is the primary rule of modernization, was manifested in the standardization of the width of the boulevards. Statistical Review reported that the width of the streets was planned to be 10 meters. In the new city, streets were planned to be about 21 meters. Statistical Review also described how new streets were opened in the old city, how the new city administration dealt with the property rights, how it solved the complex issues of land parcels owned by many different families. It also claimed that solving the ownership problems was not too complicated in the new city, where the administration bought the land from the city and applied their plan to the unoccupied new areas. The upper part of the city had a natural border between a hill called Karadağ. Here is the Karadağ, Black Mountain, and Kars River. This part. A name which also Engineer Street, this street is Engineer Street. A name which also calls to mind modernization can be perceived as a line which defines an area naturally bound between the hill and the river. Beyond Engineer Streets, this part, cars extend linearly through southwest to Erzurum, in that direction to Erzurum, and northeast to Gümrük, that direction. The surrounding wall of the Kars fortress was entirely demolished, as it happened in any other modernization efforts of the 19th century. The wall was probably seen both as an obstacle to the city's expansion and a source of the ready-to-use building material. The railroad formed the northwest border of the boulevards. Oh, sorry. This. Since Kars was a garrison town on the southeastern border of the Russian Empire, the most significant area in the grid was the vast military area, as it is still used today, this area. This area combines with an impressive military church. This is the Alexander Nevsky Church, and the military cemetery, this area, with the military war memorial, this memorial, The White Boulevards and the Alexander Nevsky Church are reminiscent of the Nevsky Prospect in Petersburg. It's not surprising that Kars, a newly occupied city of the Tsarist regime, was designed like the capital of Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. One of the important features of a modern city is the creation of green areas and parks. In statistical review, the left bank of the river park, this part, was described as the fortress esplanade, sorry for my pronunciations, where no new construction was planned. The new city park, called an island, this, you can see the number 8 maybe. The new city park, called an island, was artificially planted there, lit with lamps, and was intended to cheer up the, again, depressing environment of Kars. The essential requirements of modernity, modern citizenship, and its daily life is revealed by the following quotation from Statistical Review. A place where one could rest after a hard day's work was considered a public necessity. In the Project Safe Armenian photograph archive in Watertown, I found some photographs from Kars. A photograph of the park shows that it was not only a place for recreation and pleasure, but also a place for political scene in daily life. However, political actions that took place there were far from being organized ceremonial political rituals, but rather spontaneous daily activities. The photograph shows Armenian cavalry acting as guards for General Harbert, leaving governor's house after dinner. Statistical Review also commented on the obstacles of the city's growth. Even though the city tended to extend to the east in the direction of Gümrü, the residents didn't have full property rights. And the 1884 land law didn't allow them to either use bank loans or transfer ownership. As a result, housing demands, mainly for civil servants, couldn't be solved. Some of the economic difficulties also needed to be resolved by the establishment of the money credit systems, especially for lower income Kars residents. Supplying the city with running water was also noted as one of the main priorities. Further, the authorities hoped that the growth of the city's population due to the development of agriculture and industry would also revive the city's cultural life. Now we can analyze the boulevards closely. 6 main boulevards run through the upper part of the city. The most significant one in the center was Alexandrovskaya, this street, named after Tsar Alexander II. To its left, there were Mihailovskaya Street, named after Prince Mihail, the brother of the Tsar, and then Gubernatskoye Street, where the governor's house was located. To the right of Alexandrovskaya Street, there were Loris Melikov Street, this street, named after a liberal politician and courtier of the Tsar, and Chavchadevskaya and Lazarevskaya streets, named after generals. Chavchadev's okay, it's sorry for again for all pronunciations. In other words, all major streets in the city center were named after politicians or military figures. Only the old part of the city, which remained its trading center, retained civic names for its streets running from southwest to northeast. Artisan Street, Market Street, Persian Street are them. Police Street is next to them. Yegishe Charents, in his novel Land of Nairi, in a very lively manner, depicts the daily life in the city, street by street, building by building, and shop by shop. Charents describes both the physical city and its social life. He recounts places where the wealthy and the poor met, exchanged political news, and gossiped about their own life. I'm quoting from him. Trade in the town is focused on Loris Melikov Street. You are going to remember this street? This is the loveliest part of town, as well as its dustiest and dirtiest part. This dusty, dirty, and narrow street is the nexus of all trade. Right next to the grocery shop, there is a large store with glass doors and a display window, where you find men's and women's dresses and sweets, hair combs, and foreign perfume. The store has a beautiful sign, like stores in Paris. This store's name is spelled out in French in gold letters over the black background. On the southeast of Engineer Street, and the two sides of the immense military zone, boulevards were mostly named after other celebrated generals of the Russian army. On the right of the military zone, besides the Checherdevskaya and Lazarevskaya streets, Alhozovskaya and Ridevskaya streets were named after Russian generals. On the left, this part, Grabevskaya Street was named after General Mikhail Grabe, and Belinskaya Street was named after Colonel Belinsky. On the narrow middle southeast part, in this part, between the military zone and the railroad, shorter streets were named after workshops of the army. Blacksmith Street, Arsenal Street, Foundry Street, Locksmith Street, and Workshop Street. The rest of the boulevards were also called after Army's major divisions, such as Artillery Regiment and Demining Regiment. These boulevards and other public spaces of the city, main squares and the city park, were re-illuminated by modern lamps after the replacement of outdated lamps. To summarize the discussion of the street names, we can say that as a city ruled by the military and the border garrison of the Russian Empire, Kars explicitly represents the army on almost every axis of the city grid and every scale. The hierarchy of the Russian Empire was particularly well presented at the outskirts of the castle on a naturally higher level. I should note that this logic of hierarchy was picked up by the Turkish Republic. Thus, primary avenues were renamed after Turkish national icons. The central Alexandrovskaya Street was renamed after Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic. On the both sides of the Atatürk boulevards, two streets bear the names of important military personas. Gazi Ahmet Muhtar Pasha, who was the hero of the 1855 Crimean War, and Kazım Karabekir Pasha, who regained Kars from the Russians. Gubernatskaya Street was renamed as Ordu Caddesi, which means army in Turkish. In the end, a new city with European-style buildings, it's again the definition of statistical review, was created. The definition of the European style as it is applied to Kars opens a discussion because Turkish historians define Kars architecture as neither European nor Russian but Baltic. Statistical Review briefly mentioned some of these outstanding, it's their definition, outstanding European style buildings. The governor's house, the treasury, schools, hospitals, hotels, and some private buildings. In the passage of Statistical Review, one can feel the sense of pride with the outstanding buildings of these modern institutions in Kars. At that point, we can ask who designed these outstanding buildings or was involved in their constructions. I was able to figure out a number of professional architects and engineers who worked in Kars. Erams Francevich Salotsko-Pertishe, a graduate of St. Petersburg Civil Engineering Institute, was one of them. From his graduation until 1902, he held the position of city architect in Kars, was a member of the local building department and constructed up to 15 buildings and 150 small shops in the city. He also designed the Greek Orthodox Church. David Grimm, professor of the Institute of Civil Engineers and chair of the Department of Architecture at the Imperial Academy of Arts, restored the ancient Armenian Church of Apostles in Kars as Russian Orthodox military cathedral and built a new tower for it. Grimm, who was also co-architect of the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Tbilisi, wrote a book, Monuments of Byzantine Architecture in Georgian and Armenia, and he knew the Caucasus well. However, I do not have information if he had any other involvement in Kars development. Now we can focus on monuments and churches which were built to commemorate the Russian Empire on its new urban landscape. A major focus point in the city was the Alexander Nevsky Church, as I mentioned, and it was built within a vast ceremonial area. Previously, we didn't have information about the architect of the Alexander Nevsky Church in Kars. Now we learned from Stovich, author of the book Church of the Army and Navy, that the church was built according to a type military project. It was employed in Kars in 1908. We also know that this type project was designed by Fedor Verbitsky and applied in over 65 locations around the Russian Empire. Other than Russia and Turkey, the countries where standard military churches were built include Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Poland, Ukraine, Finland, Latvia, Belarus, and Moldova. This is the drawing of the type project. You will all recognize the tower and onion dome, and after the tower you can see 3 windows before the door, and after the door 2 windows, and these are all in the same plan. Tower, 3 windows, door, 2 windows, the same project. Standardization is always the part of industrialization and mostly related to secular issues, such as houses, factories, or hospitals. Here, standardization of a religious space is quite interesting. A standard church plan for the army was needed, in quotation, to raise religious and moral education in the troops. The standard layout provided churches where they were needed economically and rapidly. Places most suitable for a standard military church project were, I'm quoting again, mainly on the outskirts of the Russian Empire or in completely deserted areas or among peoples of different faiths. This subject needs more inquiry. Since the towns of Oltu, Artvin, and Sarıkamış were among the 65 places where military church type projects were built. Across from the Alexander Nevsky Church, a vast cemetery for soldiers who lost their lives in the war of 1877-1878 was built, including a 30-meter-high war memorial. A photograph from the Ottoman archives that I found, sent by Kars ambassador of the Ottomans in 1910, depicts the monument clearly. This photograph is not only helpful to document a destroyed monument, but it also shows the continuing interest of the Ottomans, who gathered information from its lost land. When Kars was regained from the Russian Empire in 1918, the war memorial in the military cemetery was firstly deconstructed, leaving only its base. For Georg Kobro, author of an important book on Kars, this attempt at deconstruction was understandable, since the monument had provocative figures, which symbolized the Russian-Ottoman conflict. In the monument, briefly, a Russian soldier was stepping on an Ottoman flag. In his memoir, Kazım Karabekir described how the monument was demolished. Initially, only the head of the Russian soldier was destroyed. However, by order of Şevki Pasha, the monument was later blown up, leaving only its base. Russian documents explained an urgent need for Orthodox churches. As I noted, the ancient Armenian Church of the Holy Apostles was officially converted to a Russian Orthodox church, and its restoration was completed by David Grimm with a new tower. Then this church was renamed Kars Military Cathedral. However, the Alexander Nevsky Church and the Kars Military Cathedral didn't seem sufficient for the Orthodox population. Driven by the local Greek community, a new church was built in 1893. The architect of the Greek Orthodox Church was Erasmus Francevich Solotko Petrice, as I noted above. Another important church is the Armenian Church. However, I couldn't get any information from the Russian sources about this 19th century Armenian church yet. To conclude this part, we can say that an embryo of urban bourgeoisie life was emerging in Kars during the Russian occupation. The modern urbanization symbols, such as regular street patterns, European-style buildings, public squares, city parks, monuments decorating public spaces, macadamized streets and squares, lit public spaces at night, vivid cultural life, banks and loans, shops with luxury goods, and so on, came all to stage in Kars. All of this was done to modernize the city and lighten up its depressed look. As I noted, the term of depressing used by Russian chroniclers is quite striking. In the discourse of statistical review, not only cemeteries, but also the lack of trees was seen as a source of depression in Kars. The province of Kars, Ardahan, Kağızman, Oltu were also described as depressing areas of Turkish rule. Regular and wide streets decorated with row trees were all presented as something impossible under the Turkish rule. The Russian modernization program, fighting this depressed look, was perceived as providing better prospects for the region than the Turkish rule would. This discourse sounds quite familiar to me, since I published a research on People's Houses, a cultural organization of the early Republican period. I have read thousands of pages about how the modern Turkish Republic was fighting with the depressing atmosphere in Anatolia, how it brought happiness to people, and how it was serving Anatolia better than Ottoman rule would. Namely, the modern actors, be it the Russian Empire or the Turkish Republic, claimed similar arguments and reacted in similar ways. One may say that comparing the Russian Empire with the Turkish Republic was not fair, since they were neither contemporaneous nor politically equivalent regimes. However, at some point in time, they shared similar ideas of modernization, even though they operated in different historical periods and on different political terms. Where a republic differed from an empire was in its relationship with the religion. The Turkish Republic didn't use mosques either at the center of daily life or in the city centers. They used people's houses. Looking at the frames of secularization, the Turkish Republic was similar in this way to the Soviets. Did the Russian Empire's modernization effort achieve its goal in Kars? Was the Russian Empire able to create a new modern city out of depressed old Anatolian town? General Evgeny Markov summarized his impression of Kars in his memories. We stayed at Hotel Imperial. Overall, Kars looks like an Asian city, but when you stroll its streets, you see many European houses, stores and shops, and horse carriages with cabmen, although there is little public dressed in European style, and there are plenty of soldiers and officers. Obviously, I do not intend to conclude a complex discussion with an opinion of one army officer. However, it's meaningful to have some idea. Even after such an ambitious effort by the Russian Empire, Kars was not European enough for an upper-level Russian army officer. Overall, Kars still looked Asian to him. Did the Turks appreciate Russians' modernization efforts when they regained Kars back? First, we must say that the 40 years of Russian occupation was called as the Dark Ages, Kara Yıllar. In his book, The History of Kars, a local historian, Professor Kırzoğlu, described the Dark Ages as follows. Without any right of expropriation, monuments were demolished in order to eradicate any traces of the Turks from towns and villages. The city of Kars was removed from the old Ottoman landscape. 4 large boulevards, together with the current 8 main avenues, were opened with the Armenians and the Greeks, who populate and gained the control of the municipalities in the city, and construction were made in the Baltic style and with a heavy and unpleasant appearance. Kırzoğlu didn't use the term Asian like Russian general did, but obviously he was sorry that Kars lost its Turkish character. Kırzoğlu's nationalist test of architecture was particularly conveyed in the words heavy and unpleasant appearances, which judged the quality of Russian architecture harshly. That is, the ugliness of these buildings should be overcome through the nationalization of the city. His hatred of what he called the Baltic style was widespread. The term Baltic style is not a typical term in Turkish architectural history writing. It was probably introduced by Kırzoğlu himself. It seems that he preferred that term for political reasons. He didn't use the term European because the young Turkish Republic was not against Europeanization. So he couldn't characterize the undesired architecture by this term. This dilemma might have helped forge a new Baltic style, a geographical reference which implies a specific area, but not Russia. In fact, Kırzoğlu was right about the destruction of Islamic monuments. Because the conflicts between the Turks, Russians, and Armenians had caused severe damage to Ottoman historical sites, the destruction of Ulu Cami, Grand Mosque, and minaret of Abdi Ağa Cami should be mentioned here. Along with the destruction of the entire settlement of Kaleiçi Mahallesi and its fortification walls. As it was claimed in Karl Marx's famous phrase, all that solid melts into air, the monuments are not enduring anymore. Neşe Gurallar claimed the same idea in his poem, The Monument. I erect a monument to myself in a time difficult for monuments when everything called immortal is collapsing. As we have seen, the war memorial was demolished first when Kars was recaptured from the Russians. However, the destruction of the war memorial was not enough to erase the memories of 40 years of the Dark Ages. Despite being a historian, Kırzoğlu seemed to never evaluate the labor of building effort of the Tsarist regime as a common heritage of humankind. How could a historian be so ignorant about the value of architecture? Did this perspective have any effect on the decision to demolish? I'm not going into details of these destructions, which I studied in a previous paper. However, I must briefly say that the demolition of these significant monuments of Kars was frequently realized after the 1950s, when a more nationalist government came to power. The magnificent and beautiful Onion Dome and its tower of the Alexander Nevsky Church were cut off. The same happened to another magnificent church in Sarıkamış. The Armenian church in the middle of the main boulevard was entirely eradicated from the map. The Greek Orthodox Church was also removed, and the central mosque was constructed in its place. Yet, on the contrary to Kırzoğlu, the ordinary people of Kars, such as my parents, sincerely appreciated the magnificence of these churches and felt great sorrow when the churches were demolished. They were always proud of the broad and long boulevards, loved the gridded plan of the city, admired splendid Russian stone buildings, and called Kars as the Paris of East Anatolia. As I said in the beginning, I am trying to have a history of a city to be written peacefully rather than carrying such hate onto future generations. By answering the questions of why we are remembering Kars and how we are remembering it, we may find a healthy way of writing history. Thus, history writing can be helpful in reconciliation at conflict cities. I hope writing of Kars history may open a new way to write other cities' histories in Anatolia, such as Kayseri, Muş, Van, Harput, Diyarbakır, as well as other cities which had diverse cultural backgrounds in South Caucasus and Balkans. In Turkey, after dinner, before our guests leave, we serve them the last drink, usually rakı, to give our visitors the last taste on their way back home. We call it yolluk, which means for the road. As a yolluk, one for the road, I will read last poem from Neşe Gurallar. Earth-colored ghosts filled the hungry city, A sadness which had settled like a stone on my shoulders grew heavier. I saw you again, my childhood, my yearning, my cars. Thank you.